Today we're going to use volumetric lighting to create indoor God rays and then floating dust particles using Blender. Hey guys, welcome to CG Cowboy. I'm Dale Forbes, and today we're going to use volumetric lighting to create this God ray effect coming in through a window and really top it off using a floating dust particle system. Now I know it's pretty popular to use post, either Photoshop or GIMP, to create these particles after the fact, but I really wanted to do this in Blender, and I think you're going to like this technique. Let's check it out. First, we'll create a simple room with an opening for a window. We'll set up our camera and create a view to the outside. Then we'll add a window to the opening using the Windows Generator add-on, and then we'll add a sun and our volumetric cube, tweaking to get the desired effect. In the second part, we'll create two particle systems to contain the dust. Then we'll use the compositor to render the dust and make the final adjustments. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is just to create a room. Now, the room is not the focus here. The focus is really just the volumetric lighting or the God rays coming in through the window. But obviously I need a room to work on. But you should use this technique to put it in your own room. This is not going to be a very cool room. But I like the origin point to be on the bottom out of habit. So I'm going to go into edit mode, grab my cube, go up the z-axis 1, and now I'm scaling where I want to scale. I don't need this light, by the way. So we're not going to use that light. Just to create my room, scale it up a little bit. Scale it again, Shift Z, so I'm only scaling it on the X and Y axis, and let's just create a window in this corner over here. Tab into edit mode. I'm going to do a loop cut to start my window, another one, and then on the other side, and that's pretty good right there. Go into face select mode and then pop that out to create my window. Alright, now let's go inside and let's set up our camera. So I just want to get a decent angle here. That's actually pretty good. That's pretty good right there. And then I'm going to hold down Control Alt 0 on the numpad to bring my camera to this view, and then just grab the edges and line it up. That's pretty good right there. We don't need to get fancy here. We just want to make sure that we can see the effect. Now I do want to see something out the window. I'm not going to use the world lighting here in order to create the effect, but I do want to see something. So I'm going to go ahead and grab another window, and I'm just going to bring in an image on a plane. So of course, import images as planes, and I'm going to use just an old project of mine. Z into wireframe mode, rotate it along the x-axis 90 degrees, bring it in the general vicinity, rotate it, and now I can scale it up. I'm going to go into material view so I can see what I'm looking at, and that's good enough right there. We'll close this window. Now I should have done something when I brought this in. I should have made it an emission instead of diffuse, so I think it defaults to diffuse. So I'll show you what I mean. It brings in the material setup for you when you import an image as plane, but I don't want it as a diffuse, so I'm going to Shift S, change that diffuse shader to an emission shader. And then now if I render this real quick in the viewport with Shift Z, now I can actually see what I'm looking at. I am going to change this to about half of the emission strength, and then that way it looks a little bit more like a sunset type of amount of light hitting the church. Alright, I'm also going to change this to border select so we don't get distracted and only render the edges of the camera. Alright, so the next thing I want to do is I actually want to fill this hole that we put in the wall here with an actual window. Now I'm going to use the Window Generator 3 add-on. If you don't have this, you need to get it if you're doing a window ever. It's a great add-on. So I'm going to select my room. I'm going to tab into edit mode, go into vertices select, and I'm going to Shift select those two vertices because I'm going to Shift S and snap my cursor to the middle of there. So Shift cursor to selected. And then if I tab back out, now when I add my window, which is here, it's going to put it right where I want it. So I'm going to bring this down. We don't need to look at this for now. I'm going to rotate my window along the z-axis 90 degrees. And then I'm going to hit my N for side panel so I can come over here and actually start working with my Windows properties. Now I do want a crossbar here along the middle. I'm going to hit 3 on the numpad to go into right view. Because that'll help me with the shadow effect that we'll see in a little bit. So I'm going to change my vertical count to 2, pull this out so I can see my numbers. And this takes a little bit of getting used to, but these two numbers here are now my vertical height. So this one's obviously way too high. I'm going to bring this down, then bring the other one up to fill the height. And then I'm going to change all these to 60. These are my horizontal width or vertical width, whatever that is. Now here's something that, you see how this is a darker blue than the others? I realized after doing this a few times, that means it's not going to render transparent like the others are. So I actually just had to keep tweaking these a little bit in order to make that happen the way I wanted it to. It was kind of strange. Also, these, I don't need these frames here in those extra windows. So I'm going to bring this height down a little bit. I got a little bit of a gap, so bring the other one back up. This doesn't have to be perfect. We're just going to a certain effect. And then you see how these change as I tweak these. I don't understand that. Now they're all the same color, so I should be okay. I'm going to go into wireframe mode just to make sure I'm good. Oh, I need to scale along the Y and bring those in to fill my window. All right. So now, if I hit numpad 0 to go into my camera view, do a quick render in the viewport, now I got my window in place. Now I'm ready to put in my volumetrics. But before I do, let's put in the sun lamp, because that's really what's going to give us the effect that we want. Bring in the sun, bring in the sun. Go into front view, ortho, rotate it, and then bring it up just so it hits the middle of that window. Right there. Perfect. And then I'm going to go to my settings for the sun. Settings for the sun. Okay. Change it to 2. Multiple importance. I don't need more than 1 bounce. And then I'm going to give it a little bit of a golden color to it. That's good enough right there. Back into my camera view. Shift Z, see if I got a little bit of light. And it doesn't really matter right now because I need my volumetrics. Alright, so let's create another cube, because this is where we're going to create our volumetrics. Scale this up. Bring it in. I'm going to go into my camera view, and I'm going to change the max draw type of this guy to wired so it's not in my way. There. Now I can see the dimensions of it. I'm going to scale it along the Z-axis back down, and that should be, let's scale along the X-axis a little bit. Alright, that should be pretty good right there. And now let's give it that volumetric material. We're going to change the diffuse to be a volume scatter, and then move that into the volume of our material output. And now if I do a quick render, now I see I got that volumetrics. Now that's way too dense. So the first thing we're going to do is bring that density down to 0.1, and that's much more realistic. And now you can see, hopefully you can see, that sidebar in the window is giving us a little bit of that shadow effect. And we'll go through how we're going to control that a little bit more. But let's enhance our volumetrics a little bit more by creating a volume absorption as well, and then adding those two together with an add shader. Now that's still too dense, so my volume absorption also has to come down quite a bit. Much, much better. Now, excuse me, we're only looking at this at about 10 samples. And what's going to help us really get the right definition in how much shadow we need and how much light fall off is when we start rendering this at a lot more. And I'll show you what it looks like at 1,000 samples, but after just a couple more tweaks. So one of them is the shadow itself of the sun. So here's my volumetric cube. I'm actually going to change the name of that. We'll call it Hay so I can find it later on. Here's my sun, and I'm going to bring my shadows a little bit sharper. So I'm going to change this size. The smaller the size, the more sharp these shadows are. So if I change this to, let's make it 1 centimeter. Now you can really see that defined shadow from that crossbar. Now from doing this before, I really liked it at about 5 centimeters. So I'm going to keep it about right there. And then the other thing in my volume cube is I want to change this light fall off. So this light, as it comes out the window, is almost constant in density as it goes all the way across the frame. But if I want that to fade out as it goes toward the right side of the frame, then I can play around with this anisotropic value. And for me, I found about 0.6 in this particular view worked pretty well. And now you can see it starts to really fade out about right here. And by the time it reaches the right side of the frame, you can hardly see it at all. But yeah, that's a real quick and dirty volumetrics coming in the window. But let's see what this looks like at about 1,000 frames. 1,000 frames? About 1,000 samples. Oh, but just before I do that, I'm actually going to set up my render layers first, and there's a reason for this. And the reason I'm going to do multiple render layers is because I know I'm going to add dust particles to this. And those dust particles really need to be rendered in a separate layer, and that's because they need a different light than what we're using to create this volumetric lighting through the window. So I'm going to change this render layer to room, and I'm going to create another one. That's going to be layer 1. And then I'm going to create another one, and we'll call it dust only, and that's going to be layer 2. And for the dust, I do not want any environmental lighting to affect the dust. I only want the light coming in the window to affect the dust. So now I'll go ahead and render out the room in 1,000 samples. Alright, so here we are at 1,000 samples, and you can see what I mean. Now that we've really cranked up the samples on this, you can see there is much more definition than what we were looking at in the viewport window, but it's still pretty darn good. I mean, you've got your fall off, but it happens a little bit further away. You've got some pretty sharp defined shadows created by the edges of the window, and the way you want to control that, of course, is going to be through your anisotropic value. So the higher the value, the closer to the window that fall off occurs. And then, of course, the sharpness of the shadows is going to be the size of your sun. So we used 5 centimeters here. So this is only about half of the resolution. So what's that? 960 by 540. And that took, even with 2 GPUs, it took almost 3 minutes to render this guy. Now that we have a simple volumetric lighting system to create those guide rays, let's really top this off with floating dust particles. Alright, so let's create some dust particles. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to create, over in a layer that I'm not going to render, I'm going to create the dust particles themselves. So I'm going to hit Shift Z to put my 3D cursor back in the middle. Shift C, yep. And I'm going to create the particles out of 2 different types of objects. So we're going to start with a plane. I'm going to rotate it along the x-axis 90 degrees, which is not very important, but I just like to look at it this way. Scale it in on the x-axis a little bit, and I'm going to move it over here in the front row. And I'm also going to create an icosphere, but only with 1 subdivision. I'm going to move that guy along the back row. Now let's work on our plane for a second. Now I'm going to subdivide it, just give it a little bit of geometry, not much. So I'm going to create 2 loop cuts. So I'm going to Control R and then scroll up on the mouse wheel just once to create the 2 loop cuts, and escape to lock that in. And then let's add an array modifier. And when I add the modifier to it, I want there to be enough of an offset where they're not touching each other. And let's just go with 10 on the count. And I'm going to go ahead and create a displacement modifier with a new texture of clouds. And we're going to go with a hard noise type and also of a basis of cell noise. And I'm sure there's 100 different ways you could do this. This is the way I did it. It seemed to work out pretty well for me. Now 0 on the depth, and we're getting some really jaggedy shapes here. But especially when we go back into the displacement modifier and we change this to a strength of 2. Now the one other thing I want to do here to give it a little bit more randomness control is I'm going to create a empty. Let's move this to the front, because when I go to my displacement modifier, I'm going to control the displacement based on that empty. So now if I move my empty around, it's changing the randomness of my displacement, which I think is just really cool. Now let's go ahead and add a material. We are going to use diffuse, but we're going to make it a little bit more gray. I'm also going to add a translucent shader. Translucent, not transparent. Also make that a little bit more on the gray side. And then I'm going to add those two together using an add shader. And that is it for my dust material. One other thing I want to do here before I focus on the icosphere is make it part of a group. And we're going to call that group dust balls. And basically, we're just making the dust particles here that we're going to make to be part of the particle system. And I want that particle system to be made up of these objects as well as something similar with the icosphere. Now, since I've already done the modifiers, the material, and even the group for the planes, I really just want to do the exact same thing to the icosphere. So I'm going to select my icosphere, shift select my plane, control L to link material, control L again to link the group to make it part of the dust balls group, and control L again for the modifiers. And now my icosphere has that same modifier. Again, using the empty so I can move the empty around and control the randomness of that modifier. Now it's important that these are not touching because we're going to separate them to make them all individual objects. And the way we're going to do that, now if they are touching, just go back into the modifier, and then just increase this relative offset increase it until they're not touching. So if I go back to my planes, I'm going to go ahead and apply the array, but by applying the array, they're all still the same object. They're not separate. So to make them separate, I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to hit A a couple times until all the vertices are selected, and then hit P to separate these by loose parts. Loose parts meaning they're not touching. So if they were touching, they're going to become part of the same object. So if I go ahead and do that, tab it into object mode, now they're all separate individual objects. They all have the same material, and they're all in the same group. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing to the icosphere. Tab into edit mode. Actually first, gotta apply the modifier, array modifier. Tab into edit mode, P, separate by loose parts. Tab back in object mode, and I'm good to go. So now I have all of these guys. If I look into the properties, they're all part of the dust balls group. I don't know why I grabbed that. Alright, so now let's go into layer 2. This is where I'm going to create the particle system itself, and I'm going to do it using a cube. And I'm going to shift select layer 1, Z into wireframe mode so I can go ahead and line this up. I'm going to line this up along my window. Bring it down. Look at my camera view. And I'm going to change this maximum draw type as well. Make that wired so it's not in my way. And that's pretty good. And now what I want to do is I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to go into face select mode, and I want to make this go down along where my rays are. So I'm going to grab this back face here. Whoops, zero back into my camera view. I'm grabbing that back face here, and I just want to drag it down, but I want to drag it down straight away from the window, so I don't want it to move along the y-axis. So I'm going to hit G for grab, Shift Y to lock in the y-axis, and then just bring it straight back, just like that. Alright, and that should be pretty good for my particle system. So let's go ahead and add those particles to it. New. We're going to do two particle systems. One for small, dust small, change it there and change it here. It's not animated, so I want everything to render on the first frame. And they're going to be 2000 for the small particles. I don't want it to be on the faces. I want it to be in the volume. Not even. Make it random. And then let's go ahead and randomize the rotation of all of our particles. Make them really small. Let's do 0.001 using the group of the dust balls that we created. Now you can like barely see them, but that's okay. And then of course we want to randomize that size completely. We don't want to render the box itself, so uncheck emitter. And I think that's pretty much all we needed here. But we're going to go ahead and just create another particle system. So let's add the second one. Dust large. And we're going to pick the dust small group because almost all the settings are the same. Click plus so we make it its own. Dust large. That way we're not affecting the particle system of the dust small that we just inherited from. Only 200 of these. And the size we're going to make 0.002 to make them just a little bit bigger. And you can kind of see them in there. But what's really going to make these come out is the light itself. So we want to go back to our sun, and we really want to jack up the strength of the sun. And it was 2 to create the rays. And by the way, if you wanted to change your rays and make it a little bit more prominent, you can of course increase that a little bit. But here for the dust, we're really going to jack it up to about 6. And we're going to go into the compositor to render this, and that's because we don't want to affect our original layer. We already rendered this at 1,000 samples. Now let's go ahead and create a viewer node here. And I'm going to I'm shift slicing that so I can just go to both of these at the same time. And I'm going to shift D this one that we already rendered, do the dust only, and then use a color mix node with add. And of course, if I show my backdrop, I'm only seeing the rays so far. I haven't even rendered my dust yet. So what I've done is I've increased my rays, my sun strength, to 6, and I'm ready to render only the dust. And I can do that just by clicking the camera. And this one we're actually going to wait for because it's really quick, even at 1,000 samples, which is what I'm doing here, although half resolution. And you can see now, I'll pull this down a little bit, I've got my dust in here. I hit fit, and you can see my dust particles. And it's already looking pretty darn good. But if for some reason, depending on your scene, if you saw that they're a little bit too bright, maybe 6 was too much, you can actually just use your factor here and go pretty far down where now you can hardly see any. I'm going to jack it all the way back up just so we can see what we're looking at here. And yeah, you've already got some pretty good dust particles in there. Now there's one other change that I want to make though, which I thought gave it a pretty good enhancement, and that is a filter of a defocus. Now this defocus node is used for controlling depth of field. So if you wanted to use a control depth of field in the compositor, then this node is really good for that, and I think it helps us here too. So if I use the Z depth and bring that into the factor here, now watch what happens to the dust particles. They're like disappearing, and that's because my max blur is already at 16. Now if I bring that way down, then I don't have any blur, and I see my particles again. But what I'm going to do is, just so I can see how to tweak this, I'm going to go ahead and jack it way up and bring my Z scale, so no depth of field, to 0. And then I'm going to start to tweak it. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here so I can see my particles. And I'm going to hold down shift, and I'm going to slide my Z scale until I see a lot or even most of my particles start to fade away, and you'll see why in a second. So if I hold down shift and I just start increasing this, you can see them start to disappear. I've got a few particles left, and let's just go right there. So pretty small number. Now if I take my max blur down to even all the way down to 1, you get a really nice mixture of particles that are in focus and some that are a little bit blurred out. So if I fit this back to my screen, then you can see what kind of effect that creates. So this is going to depend a lot on your particular scene, but I think it just goes a really long way in controlling that final look of the dust particles. In fact, I'm going to hold down shift, pull this window out, and then maximize that guy, and you can see, now this is only half resolution, but you can get a better idea of what that scene looks like. Guys, thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. If you have any suggestions for other videos, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Cheers.